The gun was already cocked when Grace Whitfield walked into the Dusty Crown saloon, and every soul in Redemption Creek, Colorado knew whose name was on the bullet. Her name. She stood in the doorway with the last of the August sun burning orange behind her, her traveling coat, a deep charcoal wool she had sewn herself back in Philadelphia, pulled tight around her shoulders like armor. Dust from 400 miles of railroad and stagecoach clung to the hem. Her dark hair was coming loose from its pins. Her brown eyes were sharp and absolutely unafraid, even though the man pointing the revolver at her chest was Silas Drummond, and Silas Drummond had already killed 2 men that summer without a single legal consequence. "You are the woman who wrote those letters," Silas said. His voice was low and ugly, the kind of voice that had never once in its life been told no. "You are the one who has been writing to Judge Carver about my land deeds." Grace did not step back. She did not raise her hands. She looked at the barrel of the gun the way a schoolteacher looks at a student who has misbehaved, with measured, unyielding patience. "I am," she said. The saloon went absolutely silent. Somewhere at the back, a chair scraped. Somewhere near the bar, a glass was set down very carefully on the counter. "Then you ought to know," Silas said, "that women who meddle in business they do not understand tend to disappear out here, and nobody asks too many questions." It was exactly then that Grace heard the boots. Slow, unhurried, deliberate, the boots of a man who was not afraid either. She felt the presence beside her before she saw the face, and when she glanced sideways, she saw him for the first time. Calvin Collier was 31 years old, built like the land itself, solid, patient, marked by weather. He had hazel eyes that could go either green or gold depending on the light, and right now, with the dying sun coming in through the saloon door, they were very, very gold. He had a marshal's badge pinned to his chest, though nobody in Redemption Creek had yet told her there was a marshal. He stepped forward until he was standing half a pace in front of her, between her and the barrel of Silas Drummond's gun, and he did not draw his own weapon. "Put it down, Silas," he said. His voice was quiet. It did not shake. Silas stared at him for a long moment, and the whole saloon held its breath, and then slowly, like a man who was making a promise he intended to collect on later, Silas lowered the gun. Calvin did not exhale with relief. He just turned to look at Grace. "You picked a hell of a day to arrive," he said. And Grace, who had spent every day of the last 3 months preparing herself for exactly this kind of moment, who had sold every piece of furniture she owned back in Philadelphia to buy her train ticket and her wool coat and her pride, looked at Calvin Collier and said, "I picked the right territory." He looked at her for one long beat. Then something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the suggestion that a smile had once lived there and might live there again. That was the beginning. 3 months earlier, Grace Whitfield had been sitting in a narrow office on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, reading a newspaper advertisement that had been tucked between a piece on railroad expansion and a column about women's suffrage petitions. The advertisement was brief. It said that the town of Redemption Creek, Colorado, population 212, was in need of a schoolteacher and a town doctor, and that the town council would provide modest housing and a first month's salary upon arrival. It gave a postal address and the name of the town's elected mayor, one Harold Pierce. Grace was 26 years old. She had been a teacher at the Clark Academy for girls for 4 years, and she was very good at it, and she was not in love with it. She was the daughter of Edward Whitfield, a Boston lawyer who had died of a fever when Grace was 14, leaving her mother and her younger sister Clara with a respectable name, a small house, and very little money. Grace had educated herself ferociously, reading everything she could find, and had eventually earned a teaching certificate from the Philadelphia Normal School. She was intelligent, she was organized, she was the kind of person who made decisions and then executed them without excessive hand-wringing. She was also lonely in a way that the city, with all its people packed tightly together, could not seem to cure. She had never been engaged. There had been a man named Robert Hale, a banker's son, who had courted her for 8 months and then told her with great politeness that he admired her mind but found her opinions rather too present for a wife. Grace had thanked him civilly and gone home and cried for exactly one night, and the next morning she had gone to the library and checked out 2 books on Western geography. That had been 2 years ago. The advertisement in the newspaper was not fate. Grace did not particularly believe in fate. But she did believe in action, and she believed in courage, and she believed that a person who was not happy where they were standing had the absolute right to pick up and stand somewhere else. She wrote to Mayor Harold Pierce the same afternoon. She listed her qualifications. She asked specific questions about the school building, the number of students, the existing curriculum, and the housing arrangement. She was practical and direct and professional. Mayor Pierce wrote back in 3 weeks. His letter was warm and enthusiastic. Redemption Creek had 43 children of school age. The schoolhouse had been built the previous spring, funded largely through the efforts of several ranching families. The housing was a small 2-room cabin adjacent to the schoolhouse. The salary was $20 per month. He also mentioned, almost as an aside, that the town had recently hired a new marshal by the name of Calvin Collier, who had come up from New Mexico Territory with a solid reputation and a clean record, and that the council felt good about the direction the town was heading. Grace did not think much about the marshal at the time. She was too busy giving her notice at the Clark Academy, writing to her mother and Clara in Massachusetts to explain her plans, selling her furniture, and packing the things that mattered into 2 trunks and a carpet bag. Her mother had been alarmed. Clara had been thrilled. Her colleague Margaret had called her brave. Her colleague Ruth had called her reckless. Grace had called herself practical and boarded the train. The journey from Philadelphia to Denver took 6 days by rail, rattling through Ohio and Indiana and Missouri, and the sweeping flatness of Kansas, and then the first purple shadows of the Rockies appearing on the western horizon, like something out of a painting that had no right to exist in real life. From Denver, a stagecoach carried her south and west through mountain passes and pine-forested valleys, and the driver, a stout man named Bert who chewed tobacco constantly and spoke very little, had pointed out landmarks with a nod of his head and let the landscape speak for itself. The landscape had a great deal to say. Grace had pressed her face to the small window of the stage and watched Colorado happen around her, the red rock formations, the enormous sky, the rivers running cold and fast over stones, the occasional cluster of buildings that called itself a town. She felt the altitude in her lungs and the wind in her bones even through the coach walls, and something that had been compressed in her chest for years began, very slowly, to expand. She arrived in Redemption Creek on a Thursday afternoon in August of 1878, stepped out of the stagecoach into the main street, and walked directly into the confrontation at the Dusty Crown Saloon that she had not been told was coming, and for which her traveling coat was the best armor she had. After Calvin Collier stepped between her and Silas Drummond's gun, after Silas left with the slow, deliberate anger of a man who was not finished, after the saloon collectively exhaled and went back to its business, after all of that, Calvin walked Grace out onto the boardwalk and looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot immediately classify. "Where are you supposed to be staying?" he asked. "The cabin by the schoolhouse," Grace said. "Mayor Pierce arranged it." Calvin nodded. "I'll walk you there. It's on the east side of town. You have bags at the stage stop. 2 trunks and a bag." He sent a boy who had been hovering near the doorway to collect them, pressed a coin into the boy's hand and fell into step beside Grace. The main street of Redemption Creek was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other, and the buildings along it were a combination of weathered wood and newer construction, the kind of mixture that spoke of a town that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. There was a general store, a feed and grain, a land office, a small church at the far end, the saloon, a livery, and a building that bore a sign reading simply, "Marshal." "That is yours," Grace said, nodding at it. "It is," Calvin said. "How long have you been in Redemption Creek?" 4 months. She glanced at him sideways. So you are also new. Newer than most, not as new as you. He looked at her. Why did you come? Philadelphia to Colorado is not a small decision. Grace considered being evasive and decided against it. She had not come 2,000 miles to start being evasive. I wanted to be somewhere that was still becoming something, she said. Philadelphia is already finished. Everything there is already decided. I wanted a place where the decisions hadn't been made yet. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that is either very wise or very naive, depending on who is asking. What do you think? He looked at her again, and she noticed that his eyes had shifted in the lower slant of the afternoon light from gold to green. I think it might be both, he said, and I think it might be exactly right. The cabin was small but solid, built of pine planks with a stone fireplace, 2 rooms separated by a doorway with no door, a table, a chair, a narrow iron bed with a straw mattress, and a window that looked east toward a ridge of mountains that turned pink at sunset. Grace stood in the middle of it and felt the particular satisfaction of a blank slate. Calvin set her trunks down by the far wall and went to check that the fireplace drew properly, crouching to look up the flue in the practical way of a man who had lived in many functional places and knew what to look for. I'll have someone bring wood tomorrow, he said. Thank you, Grace said, and thank you for what you did at the saloon. He stood and turned. I was doing my job. You were, she said, but you did it well and you did it for a stranger, and that is worth acknowledging. He looked slightly uncomfortable with the gratitude, the way men who genuinely lived by quiet principle tend to be uncomfortable when it is noticed. He nodded once, picked up his hat from where he had set it on the table, and moved toward the door. Miss Whitfield, he said, pausing at the threshold. Grace, she said. He looked back. Grace. Silas Drummond is not going to forget those letters. You should know that. I know that, she said. He has money and connections in this territory, and the law is not always fast enough to protect someone who gets crosswise with him. I know that too. He studied her for a moment with those shifting hazel eyes. Then why don't you look afraid? Grace considered the question honestly. I am afraid, she said. I just decided a long time ago that being afraid was not a good enough reason to stop. Calvin Collier stood in the doorway of the small pine cabin in Redemption Creek, Colorado, and looked at Grace Whitfield, and something happened in the space between them that neither of them had words for, yet something quiet and foundational, like the first stone placed in the construction of something that intends to last. Then he put his hat on and walked back into the August evening. Grace started school on Monday. There were 38 children present on the first day, ranging in age from 6 to 14, sitting in rows on pine benches with a mixture of curiosity, wariness, and the kind of restless energy that is the natural condition of children who have been outside all summer. Their names came from everywhere, Irish names and German names and Spanish names and plain English names. The children of ranchers and miners and shopkeepers, and the family that ran the feed store. One boy named Pedro, whose father worked at the livery, and one girl named Hannah, whose mother was a widow who took in laundry. Grace learned all 38 names by the end of the first morning. She organized the older children to help the younger ones with reading while she focused on arithmetic with the middle group. And by the end of the first week, she had assessed where everyone was, identified the 3 students who were genuinely advanced and needed harder material, and begun writing a letter to a publisher in Denver requesting donated textbooks. Word spread through Redemption Creek, the way word always spreads in small places, quickly and thoroughly. People began stopping by the schoolhouse at the end of the day to see for themselves what this Philadelphia woman was doing with their children. And what they saw was their children voluntarily staying 10 and 15 minutes after the bell to finish a problem or hear the end of a story Grace was reading aloud. This was a town that paid attention to results, and Grace Whitfield was producing results. She saw Calvin Collier most mornings. He had a habit of riding the perimeter of town at dawn, checking things, and his route took him past the schoolhouse and the cabin just as Grace was coming out to pump water. They fell into the easy ritual of people who share a small geography, a nod, a word or two about the weather or the town, occasionally something more. One morning, 2 weeks after her arrival, he stopped his horse entirely and looked at her more carefully than usual. "You look tired," he said. She was tired. She had been up until nearly midnight writing curriculum plans and marking the arithmetic slates. "I am fine," she said. "That's not an answer to what I said." She looked up at him. He was still mounted, and the early light was doing something extraordinary to the mountains behind him, laying them in blue and gold, and she said, "I am tired and I am fine." Both of those can be true at once. He considered this. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask. Why Silas Drummond? Why did you write to Judge Carver about him specifically? You'd only been corresponding with the town for a few months before you came. How did you even know about him?" Grace set down her water pail and straightened. "Mayor Pierce mentioned him in one of his letters. He mentioned that there were disputes over land deeds in the area, that several families had lost property claims they had filed legally, that the legal process seemed to keep coming out in favor of one particular party. He did not name Silas directly. But I have a lawyer's daughter's instincts and access to the Denver newspaper archives via a friend, and I did some reading. What I found was a pattern. Silas Drummond has been acquiring land in this valley for 3 years using documents that have some very peculiar inconsistencies." Calvin looked at her for a long moment. "You investigated him before you even arrived." "I prepared," Grace said. "There is a difference." "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Grace. Grace." He said her name the way people say a word they are still deciding how to carry. "Those letters you sent to Judge Carver, what did they say exactly?" she told him. She had documented 3 specific land deed anomalies, with dates and recorded filing numbers cross-referenced against the county land rolls, pointing to a pattern of what appeared to be fraudulent notarization. She had sent the documentation with a formal letter requesting a legal inquiry. Calvin was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "Carver is a fair man. If the evidence is what you say it is, he'll take it seriously. That is why I sent it to him." "Silas knows that too," Calvin said. "That's why he came at you the day you arrived. Someone tipped him off that the letters had been sent. He knew you were coming." Grace felt the small, cold knowledge of that settle into her stomach. Someone in Redemption Creek had been watching for her, had warned Silas, had set up that confrontation at the saloon before she could even unpack her trunks. "Someone in town is working with him," she said. "Someone in town has been working with him for a while," Calvin said. "I've been trying to figure out who." They looked at each other in the early morning light, and the thing between them shifted again. No longer just the quiet recognition of 2 people sharing a small geography, but the recognition of 2 people who were working, separately and now perhaps together, toward the same necessary thing. "I can share what I have," Grace said, "the documentation. And I can tell you what I know from the legal side," Calvin said. "It might be useful to compare." "Tonight," Grace said, "after school lets out, I am free by 4 o'clock. "I'll come by at 5, he said. "I'll bring coffee. Martha at the general store keeps a decent supply." He rode on. Grace picked up her water pail, and she was smiling, and she was not entirely sure which part of that conversation had caused the smile, but she did not interrogate it too closely. That evening, Calvin Collier sat across the small table in Grace's cabin, with a pot of coffee between them and her correspondence with the Denver newspaper archives spread out before him. And they worked. He was methodical and thorough in the way of someone trained to think about evidence, and she was precise and organized in the way of someone trained to teach complex things in logical sequence. And between them, they built a clearer picture of what Silas Drummond had been doing. 3 families had lost land claims. The Garza family, who had ranched the South Creek Valley for 7 years, had been pushed off their property the previous November after a deed challenge that the county clerk had ruled in Silas's favor. The Hoffmans, German immigrants who had built a successful wheat operation, had sold under pressure the year before that, sold for a fifth of the land's value after a series of threats they had not been able to prove. And a man named Thomas Reed, a veteran of the war who had come west to start fresh, had died in what was ruled an accident the previous winter, and his widow had left the territory within a month with her 3 children and very little money. Thomas Reed, Grace said quietly, looking at the paper in her hand. Was it truly an accident? Calvin's expression was careful. I have no evidence to the contrary. I've looked. Whatever happened to Thomas Reed, Silas covered it well. But you believe it wasn't. He was quiet for a moment. I believe that convenient accidents happen more often around certain people than they ought to, statistically. Grace looked at the document before her. The injustice of it settled in her chest like a stone, not the sharp anger of the moment, but the heavy, slower grief of patterns repeated, of power running roughshod over people who had worked hard and asked for nothing except what was legally theirs. She thought of the Garza children if they had any. She thought of Thomas Reed's widow leaving with her children and very little money, heading God knew where. We have to stop him, she said. I know, Calvin said. The legal inquiry through Judge Carver is the right path, Grace said, but it will take time, and Silas isn't going to wait quietly. No, Calvin agreed. He won't. She looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something careful and something else underneath it, something that wasn't quite careful at all. You said when I arrived that you've been trying to identify who in town is connected to Silas, she said. I have a suspicion, he said, but suspicions aren't evidence. Tell me. He hesitated for only a moment. Ned Carley, the deputy land clerk. Grace thought back through the documents she had reviewed. He is the one who certified the challenged Garza deed and the Hoffman paperwork. Then he is the link, Grace said. He is a link, Calvin said carefully. But he is also terrified of Silas, which means he is both a potential witness and a potential liability. If Silas thinks Carley might talk, Carley becomes a problem that needs solving. Grace understood immediately what that meant. We need to talk to him before Silas does. I've been thinking the same thing, Calvin said. But Carley won't talk to me alone. He shuts down. He's seen what happens to people who cross Silas. He paused. He might talk to you. Because I'm a woman, Grace said. She was not offended, just precise. Because you're a woman who stood in a saloon doorway with a gun pointed at her and didn't flinch, Calvin said. That kind of thing gets around. Carley heard about it. Everybody in town heard about it. There's something about that kind of courage that makes frightened people believe safety might be possible. Grace felt the weight of that, the responsibility of being the person whose courage someone else was borrowing to find their own. She had not come west to be a symbol. She had come west to teach children and to build something. But the territory had its own demands, and she had been the one who wrote those letters and set these events in motion, and that meant the responsibility was hers to carry. I'll talk to him, she said. Not alone, Calvin said. I'll be close. She looked at him across the small table with the lamplight between them and the mountains dark outside the window, and she thought, this man is good, not in a simple or uncomplicated way. Good in the way that requires effort and intention, the kind of goodness that has been tested and has held. She didn't know his history yet. She didn't know what had brought him from New Mexico to this specific small town in this specific mountain valley. But she could feel the shape of a person who had made hard choices for the right reasons, and that shape was not common, and she recognized it the way you recognize something you have been looking for without quite admitting it. Thank you, she said. For all of this. He began gathering papers to return to her. I'm doing my job. He said the same thing he had said the first night, the same deflection. You are doing more than your job, Grace said, and she meant it calmly without particular sentiment, just as an accurate statement of fact. He paused with the papers in his hands and looked at her, and there it was again, that thing in his face, that movement, the shape of something large and quiet considering whether to speak. He said nothing. But he did not look away. They met with Ned Carley 3 days later, in the back room of the feed and grain store, which was owned by a man named August Braun, who trusted Calvin and hated Silas with a German farmer's particular intensity. August stood outside the door and watched the street while Calvin and Grace sat across from Ned Carley, a thin man of about 40, with the look of someone who had been carrying a secret so long it had altered his posture. Grace did most of the talking. She spoke to Carley the way she spoke to her most frightened students, steadily, without pressure, acknowledging the difficulty of the situation while making clear that the path through it was the only one that led somewhere better. She told him what she had documented. She told him that Judge Carver was already looking at the evidence. She told him that the question was not whether this would come to light, but whether he would be remembered as someone who had helped or someone who had participated. Carley's hands shook through most of it. He kept looking at Calvin, who sat quiet and still, and Calvin gave him nothing but steady attention. No threat, no pressure, just the presence of someone who was not going to leave. In the end, Carley talked. He had been a land clerk for 6 years. Silas Drummond had approached him 4 years ago with what had seemed at first like minor favors, small inconsistencies overlooked in exchange for modest payments. Then the favors had grown. Then Silas had made clear that Carley was too deep in to back out, that he knew enough to ruin Carley utterly, that cooperation was the only safe option. Carley had 3 children and a wife who was ill, and he had made the terrible, human, understandable calculation that survival required compliance, and he had complied, and he had hated himself for it every day since. He had notarized documents he knew were false. He had altered filing dates on 3 separate deed applications. He had, under Silas's instruction, flagged Thomas Reed's land claim in a way that had made Reed visible as a target. He broke down when he said Thomas Reed's name. Grace got him water from the bucket in the corner of the room and sat with him while he wept, and she was neither impatient nor falsely comforting. She simply stayed, which is the thing that matters most when someone is falling apart. When he had collected himself, she said, "Will you sign a statement?" He looked at Calvin. Calvin said, "I'll get it to Judge Carver personally. I'll ride to Denver myself if I have to." Carley said, "If I sign, Silas will know." "If you sign," Grace said, "we will make sure that Judge Carver moves before Silas can act, but we need the statement." Carley was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My wife's name is Eliza. My children are James, Ruth, and the baby is William. If something happens to me, I will personally see that your family is looked after," Grace said. "I do not make promises I cannot keep." He looked at her for a moment, at this woman in her charcoal wool coat who had come from Philadelphia with her evidence and her steadiness and her willingness to make promises, and something in his face settled. Something decided. "All right," he said. "Get me paper." Calvin rode to Denver with Carley's signed statement and Grace's documentation the following week. He was gone for 4 days, and Grace taught school and did not allow herself to think too much about the fact that the cabin felt different in his absence, quieter, in a way that had nothing to do with sound. She had begun to know him by then in the small, specific ways that proximity builds knowing. She knew that he drank his coffee black and finished the cup entirely before speaking more than a few words in the morning. She knew that he was reading. He had a well-worn copy of Moby Dick in his saddlebag that he'd mentioned almost apologetically, as if the novel were an indulgence. She knew that he had been in the cavalry before becoming a lawman, and that he did not talk about the war with the bitterness she had seen in other veterans, but with a particular quietness that suggested he had processed something hard and put it somewhere he could carry it without letting it carry him. She knew that he had grown up in Tennessee, the third of 5 children, and had come west at 20 after a family situation he described simply as complicated in a way that said the word was carrying enormous weight. She had not pressed. She had her own complicated in a trunk under the iron bed, her own weight she had learned to carry without letting it crowd the table. She missed him when he was gone. She recognized the missing. She filed it carefully and did not take it out and examine it yet because there was too much else to do. When he came back with news. Judge Carver had reviewed the statement and the documentation. He had issued a warrant for Silas Drummond's arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and land deed falsification. He was dispatching a federal marshal to assist with the arrest, arriving within the week. Silas would likely hear of it before the marshal arrived. Information traveled, and Silas had informants. But Carver was moving quickly, and the legal weight of the case was substantial. Calvin told Grace all of this standing in the doorway of the cabin at sunset, still dusty from the road, and she felt the release of something that had been tightly coiled in her since she had walked into the dusty Crown Saloon 3 weeks ago and looked down the barrel of Silas Drummond's gun. "It worked," she said. "It worked," he agreed. She was so relieved that she did something she had not precisely planned to do. She stepped forward and put her hand on his arm, just the brief weight of a hand on a forearm, and said, "Thank you, Calvin." He went very still under her hand, not with discomfort, with the stillness of something that has been waiting. Then he looked down at her hand on his arm, and then he looked at her face, and the thing that had been moving between them for weeks finally stopped pretending it was something manageable. "Grace," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not precisely an answer to anything he had asked yet, but which answered everything anyway. He put his hand over hers, just briefly, the warm solidity of it, and they stood in the doorway of the small cabin with the sunset turning the mountains pink and gold behind them, and neither of them said anything more for a moment. Then he stepped back and cleared his throat slightly, and said he needed to see to his horse, which was absolutely true and also completely beside the point, and she watched him walk toward the livery with that same unhurried, deliberate stride she had first heard as boots on a saloon floor, and she went inside and stood by the window and felt the expansion in her chest that had begun on the train west continue, inch by inch, towards something she had not allowed herself to name in a very long time. Silas Drummond did not go quietly. The federal marshal, a man named Wick Patterson, arrived in Redemption Creek on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, word had reached Silas at his ranch 6 miles east of town, and Silas made the decision that a certain kind of cornered, arrogant man always makes. He decided that the rules did not apply to him, and he would simply refuse the corner. He rode into town on Thursday afternoon with 4 of his hired men and went directly to the marshal's office, which was where Calvin was, and demanded that the warrant be produced and argued on the grounds that it was based on fraudulent testimony from a criminal deputy clerk. Calvin produced the warrant. Wick Patterson stood at his shoulder. The argument that followed was conducted in the street in front of approximately 40 witnesses, and it was the kind of argument that makes everyone within earshot very aware of the thinness of the line between a legal situation and an illegal one. Silas did not draw his weapon. He was too intelligent for that. But he made clear, in front of 40 witnesses, that he considered Grace Whitfield a provocateur and a fraud, that her evidence was manufactured, that she had come to Redemption Creek specifically to destroy him for reasons he implied were connected to some unnamed external interest. He was loud and fluent in the way of a man who has bullied successfully for a long time and mistaken his own volume for substance. Grace was not present for this. She was in the schoolhouse, teaching. But Hannah, whose mother took in laundry, ran to the schoolhouse to tell her, because Hannah was 11 and could not contain the news, and Grace stepped out of the schoolhouse and walked the 2 blocks to the main street and arrived in time to hear the tail end of what Silas was saying about her. She waited until he finished. Then she spoke, clearly and calmly for the benefit of the 40 witnesses. "Mr. Drummond, I have no external interest in your affairs except the interest that any citizen of this territory has in the honest application of the law. The evidence I sent to Judge Carver is a matter of public record, available to anyone who wishes to review it at the county land office. I would encourage you to address your concerns about the accuracy of that evidence to the judge directly, which is your legal right and your appropriate recourse." Silas stared at her. The 40 witnesses looked at her. Calvin, standing beside Wick Patterson, watched her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but that was, she thought, the warmest thing she had ever seen on a human face. Silas was arrested on Thursday afternoon, walked to the town jail by Calvin and Wick Patterson with his hands cuffed, and his 4 hired men dispersed without further incident. The charges were read publicly. A date was set for a preliminary hearing before a circuit judge who would be in the territory in 6 weeks. Ned Carley cooperated fully and was charged as an accessory, a charge the judge eventually reduced significantly in light of his cooperation and his documented coercion. He kept his job, eventually, after a year's suspension and a period of supervised practice. Eliza Carley recovered from her illness the following spring, which the entire town seemed to take as a favorable sign. The Garza family was traced to Santa Fe, where they had relocated, and their land claim was formally reinstated. It took 8 months and required 3 separate legal filings, but Grace wrote every one of them herself with Calvin's assistance, and the day the Garzas came back to the South Creek Valley to reclaim their property, they brought tamales and an enormous pot of beans to the church hall, and Redemption Creek had a feast. The Hoffmans could not be traced. Their land was held in legal limbo for over a year before eventually being settled on a new family, the Youngs, who arrived from Iowa and built a proper farmhouse on the site. Thomas Reed's widow, whose name was Margaret Reed, received a letter from Grace, located through Veterans Records, and a great deal of patient correspondence informing her that her husband's name had been formally cleared of any wrongdoing, and that a small compensatory sum had been set aside by the county as part of the settlement of Silas Drummond's case. Margaret Reed wrote back a brief letter that said only, "Thank you. I told my children their father was a good man." It is good to know the record says so too. Grace kept that letter in the top drawer of her writing desk for the rest of her life. In the weeks following Silas's arrest, with the immediate danger dispersed and the legal process churning steadily forward, Redemption Creek settled into something calmer, and Grace and Calvin settled into something too, something that had been there from the beginning, built of lamplight and coffee, and the particular trust of people who have faced something hard together and come out holding. It moved slowly, because both of them were, in their own ways, careful people who had learned that the things most worth having required patience. He began appearing at the schoolhouse at the end of the day with some frequency, ostensibly because his patrol route happened to take him past that way, which was true and also not the whole truth. She began leaving the coffee pot on the stove in the evenings, which was efficient and also not the whole truth. They talked about everything. They talked about the books they had each read. He had worked through all of Melville and was attempting George Eliot and found it unexpectedly absorbing. She had opinions about Middlemarch that she expressed at considerable length. They talked about the children at the school, and he told her things about the families that helped her understand her students better, and she told him things about the children that gave him a different view of the families he was policing. He told her, one evening in late September with the first cold coming down from the mountains, that he had left Tennessee because his father had been a man who believed in a hierarchy that included owning people, and that the war had ended that particular debate definitively in the country's official position, but not in his father's personal one, and that Calvin had disagreed with his father since he was old enough to form opinions, and that the disagreement had eventually made living in the same place untenable. He had come west to find something different, something he could be part of without compromise. Grace listened without interruption. When he finished, she said, "You came west wearing your principles like a coat." He looked at her. "I came west wearing my courage like a coat," she said. "We both arrived layered." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I think you might be the most interesting person I have ever met." "I think the same of you," Grace said, and the simplicity of it, the plain, honest statement of it, without performance or deflection, hung in the air between them with all the weight of everything they had not yet said. He came to her door on a Sunday in October, not their usual weekday evening, not the end-of-day patrol, a Sunday, and knocked. She opened the door and he was standing there with his hat in his hands, which she had learned meant he was about to say something that required a particular kind of care. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "If you'll come." She came. He took her up the eastern ridge on horseback. She rode the livery's calmest mare, a sturdy gray named Pearl, along a trail that rose through stands of aspen beginning to turn gold, the air smelling of pine resin and the particular cold-and-sun combination that Colorado managed in October that was unlike any air she had breathed before. The aspens shook their leaves in the lightest wind, a sound like distant rain or distant applause. At the top of the ridge, the valley opened below them, Redemption Creek, the silver thread of the river, the patchwork of farms and ranches, the mountains on all sides, enormous and indifferent and impossibly beautiful. Grace sat on Pearl and looked at it, and Calvin sat his horse beside her, and she understood exactly why he had brought her here. This was what he was protecting. Not an abstract legal principle, not a career, not even a salary, this specific view, this specific valley, these specific people. This was what he had found when he came west looking for something different. "You love this place," she said. "I do," he said. "I did not expect to. 4 months ago I thought I was just passing through, but then I started to see what it was, what it could be." He paused. "And then you came." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the valley. "And then I came," she said. "And then you came," he said, "and you started building something, teaching those children, fighting for those families, refusing to be frightened off by a loaded gun on your first afternoon." He paused again. "And I started thinking that if you were here, then maybe I was not just passing through either." She was quiet for a moment, letting the weight of that settle appropriately. "Calvin," she said. He turned to look at her then fully, with those hazel eyes that had gone entirely green in the mountain light. "I am not a simple person," she said. "I have opinions about everything. I'm not good at being told what to do. I came 2,000 miles without asking anyone's permission, and I intend to be here for a very long time arguing with county judges and writing letters to Denver and teaching 38 children to read." 38, he said, the near smile appearing. "We have 2 new enrollments," she said. "The Yates family arrived last week." "I know," he said. "I met the father at the livery." "The point," Grace said, "is that you should know exactly what you are considering before you say anything further." "Grace," he said. "Yes. I have met you," he said. "I have been meeting you every day for 2 months. I know exactly what I am considering." She felt something enormous and warm move through her chest, the kind of feeling that a person who has been alone and useful and quietly lonely for a long time recognizes as the feeling they had almost given up on feeling. "Then say it," she said. "I want to court you," he said with simple, old-fashioned directness. "Properly, with your permission." She looked at him for a long moment with the valley of Redemption Creek spread below them, and the aspens going gold and the mountains holding up the enormous sky. "You have my permission," she said. He smiled, a real one, fully present, the kind that rearranges a face. She had not seen it before in its full form, only the shadow of it, and seeing it now was like watching the sun come over the ridge. It changed everything about the light. He courted her properly, as he had said. Properly, in 1878 Colorado, meant evenings at the cabin with the door open to propriety and the coffee on the stove, church on Sundays where people noticed and smiled, and several women made gentle remarks to Grace about what a solid man Calvin Collier appeared to be. It meant that he asked Mayor Pierce's permission to escort her to the Harvest Social in mid-October, and Pierce gave it with visible satisfaction. The Harvest Social was held in the church hall, which had been decorated with dried corn and late-season wildflowers, and there was music from a fiddle and a guitar played by the Henderson brothers, who were twins and disagreed about tempo with cheerful, ongoing fervor. Grace danced with Calvin and discovered that he danced well, not elaborately, but with the same quality his walk had, that deliberate, unhurried confidence, and they turned around the floor of the church hall in Redemption Creek, Colorado in October 1878 with people they had come to know and in some cases love watching them, and Grace thought, I made the right choice. Every choice. All of them. What are you thinking about? Calvin asked, leaning close enough to be heard over the fiddle. Philadelphia, she said, which was true and which required explanation. I am thinking about how different this is, and how much better. He pulled back enough to look at her face. Then he pulled her slightly closer in a way that was entirely within the bounds of propriety and entirely full of intention. Good, he said. In November, Silas Drummond's preliminary hearing took place before the circuit judge, a sharp-minded man from Denver named Judge Holbrook, who reviewed the evidence that Calvin and Grace had assembled over 2 months and Ned Carley's testimony and the county land records. Silas had hired the best lawyer available in the territory, a Denver man named Prescott who wore his suits very well and spoke in long, polished sentences. Prescott argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Carley was an unreliable witness with his own charges pending, and that the entire case was motivated by a newcomer with unknown grievances. Grace was called to testify. She testified for 2 hours, calmly and precisely, walking the judge through the documentation piece by piece, the dates, the discrepancies, the pattern. She did not perform emotion or outrage. She simply laid out the architecture of the fraud the way a good teacher lays out a complex problem, clearly, with each step visible and each connection made explicit. Prescott cross-examined her for 45 minutes. She answered every question accurately and without flinching, and the few times he tried to rattle her by implying she had personal motivations or insufficient expertise, she responded with such dry, specific precision that the courtroom, which included most of Redemption Creek, packed into every available seat, was noticeably enjoying itself. Calvin testified after her. He was equally precise, equally unshakable. Silas Drummond was bound over for full trial to take place in Denver the following spring. The judge denied bail on the grounds of flight risk, given Silas's resources. He left Redemption Creek in the custody of Wick Patterson and a second federal marshal, and as the wagon carried him down the main street, Grace stood on the boardwalk and watched, and she felt not triumph. She was not, at heart, a triumphant kind of person, but something more like completion. The wrong had been named. The mechanism of accountability was in motion. The Garza family was going to get their land back. Thomas Reed's widow had a letter in her hand that said her husband's name was clear. It was enough. It was more than enough. Calvin materialized beside her on the boardwalk as the wagon rounded the bend at the end of the street. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Satisfied," she said. "And hungry. I have not eaten since this morning." He laughed a real laugh, low and warm, and offered his arm, and she took it, and they went to the hotel dining room, which had tablecloths and a menu that aspired to something more than the saloon's daily special, and they ate and talked, and she watched the last of the tension leave his shoulders as the evening went on, and she thought, "I want to watch that happen for the rest of my life. I want to be the person in whose company the tension leaves." The winter came down hard in December, which everyone in Redemption Creek had warned her about, and they were right. The snow arrived not like the polite dusting she had known in Philadelphia, but with tremendous serious intention, piling against the cabin walls and drifting over the boardwalks and turning the mountains into something that could not have been improved upon by any artist's imagination. The temperature dropped to 20 below on the coldest nights, and Grace kept her fireplace burning steadily and was grateful beyond measure for the cord of wood that Calvin had made sure was stacked against her cabin wall before the first snowfall. School continued. Parents were grateful, because occupied children are easier children in the long months of winter, and Grace introduced a winter reading program that involved each student selecting a book from the small collection she was building. She had written to 3 publishers and 2 wealthy Philadelphia acquaintances, and had accumulated 63 volumes, which was 63 more than the school had possessed when she arrived, and reading and reporting on it through January. Calvin came every evening that the weather permitted, and on the evenings when the snow was too heavy, he found ways to let her know he was thinking of her, A note slipped under the cabin door, a jar of Martha's apple preserves left on the step. She responded in kind. A book she thought he would like left at the marshal's office, a plate of the corn muffins she had learned to bake in the cast iron that came with the cabin. The courtship deepened the way prairie grass deepens its roots in winter, invisibly, slowly, down toward something solid. They were not dramatic about it. Neither of them was a dramatic person in their private lives, though the public circumstances of their first weeks in Redemption Creek had been dramatic enough for a lifetime. What they were, in private, was honest and attentive and increasingly unwilling to imagine a future that the other was not in. He told her, one February evening, what had happened in New Mexico that had brought him north to Colorado. He had been a marshal in a small town called Tierra Roja. There had been a family there, Apache, the Delgado family, who had converted to Christianity 2 generations back and lived peacefully in the town, operating a small trading post. The town's most powerful rancher had decided he wanted their property and had used his connections to have the family designated as a threat, a designation that, in 1876, in New Mexico territory, could be made to carry legal weight with terrifying ease. Calvin had stood against it. He had documented, as Grace had documented. He had sent reports up the chain. He had protected the Delgado family for 8 months while the bureaucratic machinery ground on. The family had eventually been forced out anyway. Not through immediate violence, through a series of legal pressures Calvin had not been able to overcome, through the particular injustice of a system that bent in favor of money and power and against anyone who did not have both. They had gone south toward relatives. Calvin did not know where they were now. He had resigned his marshal's position the day they left. He had ridden north, not entirely sure where he was going, and Redemption Creek had posted its opening, and he had applied, and here he was. "You have seen this before," Grace said very quietly. "What happened with Silas Drummond? You have seen exactly this before." "I have," he said, "and I failed the first time." "You did not fail," Grace said. "You were outrun by a system that was not yet ready to do what was right. That is different from failing." He was looking at the fire. "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "Failing is giving up. You did not give up. You came somewhere new and you started again, and this time the outcome was different." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have a talent for taking the hardest things and making them speakable." "That is what teachers do," she said. He turned to look at her, firelight moving on his face. "It is not only what teachers do," he said. "It is what you do, particularly." She held his gaze. "Calvin," she said, "I love you." She had not planned to say it first. But there it was, plain and true, a statement she had been carrying for weeks, and which had simply decided it was done being carried quietly. He was across the small table from her, and then he was not across the table, he was beside her, and he took her hand in both of his, those hands that had been steady in saloons and steady before judges and steady in every moment she had witnessed them, and they were warm, and they held her hand with the specific gravity of something permanent. "Grace Whitfield," he said, "I have loved you since you stood in that saloon doorway with a loaded gun aimed at you and told Silas Drummond you had come west wearing your courage like a coat effectively." She blinked. "I did not say those words." "No," he said, "but it was every word you said and every way you stood and every breath you took, and it amounted to exactly that, and I thought, this woman knows what she is and knows what she is worth, and she came to exactly the right territory." His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. His eyes had everything in them. "I love you. I loved you early and I love you now, and I intend to love you for a very long time if you will have me." Grace was not a woman given to wordlessness, but for a moment, looking at Calvin Collier in the firelight of her small cabin in the Colorado mountains in February, she had nothing but the enormity of the thing, which was perfect, and which required no embellishment. "I will have you," she said. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, with the formal, deliberate care of a man who was making a promise he intended to keep forever. Spring in Redemption Creek was something that had to be experienced to be believed. The snow retreated from the valley floor in March, and the rivers ran wild with snowmelt, roaring over their banks in some places and turning the meadows temporarily into shallows. And then April brought green, not the polite green of eastern parks, but a violent, absolute, claiming green, grass and wildflowers erupting from the ground with an urgency that spoke of all those months under the snow. Calvin proposed in April, in the meadow behind the eastern ridge where they had ridden the previous October. He had the ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in a plain mounting, which he had ordered from a jeweler in Denver in January and which had arrived by post in March, and which had been sitting in his desk drawer while he waited for the moment to be right. He did not make a long speech. He said, "I want to marry you. I want to build something here with you, and I want to do it properly. Will you marry me, Grace?" She said yes before he had quite finished the sentence, which made him laugh, and she laughed too, and he put the ring on her finger and kissed her for the first time properly, fully, a kiss that meant everything it was saying, and the Colorado spring went on around them, entirely indifferent and entirely perfect. They were married in the Redemption Creek Church on the first Saturday of June 1879. The church was full. August Braun sat in the front row and cried, which surprised everyone including him. The Henderson brothers played the fiddle and guitar, this time in agreement on tempo, because Calvin had specifically requested it and they respected Calvin. Hannah and 5 other girls from the school scattered wildflowers down the aisle, late columbines and paintbrush, the kind of flowers that grew on the ridge above town. Mayor Pierce performed the ceremony, as he was also a justice of the peace, with the circuit preacher standing approvingly to the side. Grace wore a dress she had made over the winter, ivory cotton with a high collar and long sleeves and small pearl buttons down the front, no lace, no elaborate trimming, just the clean lines of something made with intention. She wore her dark hair up with the garnet earrings that had been her mother's. Calvin wore his good coat, a dark brown broadcloth he had bought in Denver specifically for the occasion, and he stood at the altar and watched her walk down the aisle, and the expression on his face was the kind of expression that the people who saw it remembered for the rest of their lives. Grace's mother Eleanor and her sister Clara had come from Massachusetts. Calvin had paid the train fare, quietly, without announcement, and the first Grace had known of it was when she opened the cabin door 2 days before the wedding and found her mother and Clara on the doorstep with their traveling trunks. She had burst into tears, which almost no one in Redemption Creek had seen her do, and which Calvin, who had arranged the whole thing and was watching from a careful distance, felt was the best use of 3 months' salary he could imagine. Eleanor Whitfield took to Redemption Creek with the adaptability of a woman who had survived her husband's early death and her daughter's departure west, and was not about to be frightened by a little altitude. She spent 2 days making Grace's wedding cake and thoroughly approving of Calvin, to whom she said, in private and with complete seriousness, "My daughter is the finest person I know, Marshal Collier. I will not embarrass either of us by pretending I do not expect you to know that." Calvin said, with equal seriousness, "I know it, Mrs. Whitfield. I have known it since the first day." Eleanor seemed satisfied. Clara was 23, bright and enthusiastic, and enamored of the West in the way of someone who had read about it and now found the reality even better than the reading. She announced within 48 hours of her arrival that she might not return to Massachusetts, which Grace suspected she would not and which turned out, in fact, to be true. Clara stayed, and eventually found her own life in Colorado, but that is a different story. The wedding ceremony was brief and honest. They said the old words with the specific attention of people who have thought about every one of them: to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others. Calvin's voice did not shake. Grace's voice was clear and firm and warm. When Pierce pronounced them married, Calvin kissed her with the whole church watching, and there was a general eruption of sound from the assembled Redemption Creek residents that could be heard, reportedly, at the livery on the far end of town. The reception in the church hall went until past midnight. People danced. Calvin danced with Grace until his feet were sore and danced on anyway. Eleanor danced with August Braun, to everyone's amusement. Clara danced with anyone who asked, which was many people. Hannah ate too much cake and had to be escorted outside for fresh air by her mother. Grace stood in the church hall at some point past 10 o'clock, looking at the room around her, the people she had known for less than a year who had become her people, the children she taught, the families she had fought alongside, the man who was now her husband standing across the room talking to Wick Patterson and laughing at something. And she felt the full weight and warmth of the life she had built. Not the life that had been assigned to her, or expected of her, or offered to her out of politeness. The life she had chosen deliberately, with her courage worn like a coat and her intelligence deployed like a tool and her heart finally allowed to lead. Her mother found her in that moment of stillness and stood beside her. "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked. "Yes," Grace said. It was the simplest and most complete thing she had ever said. Eleanor put her arm around her daughter's shoulders for a moment, and then the music started again, and Calvin appeared from across the room heading toward Grace with clear purpose, and Eleanor stepped away with a small smile, and Grace went out to meet her husband on the dance floor. The house they moved into together was larger than the cabin, a proper frame house on the north edge of town, 2 stories, 4 rooms, a real kitchen with a cast-iron stove, a porch that looked west toward the mountains. Calvin had bought the lot the previous fall, quietly, and the house had been built over the winter by August Braun and 3 other men from town, who had decided that the marshal and the schoolteacher deserved a proper house, and organized the construction as a kind of ongoing community project that Grace had not been told about until Calvin showed her the foundation in December with a particular expression of careful hope. They moved in together in June, after the wedding, and the house filled up with their combined belongings, his books and her books, creating a combined library that required its own dedicated wall of shelving, which Calvin built himself over 3 evenings in July. Her writing desk went in the parlor by the east window. His desk went in the study off the kitchen. The kitchen had a proper flour bin and a butter churn and a window that looked out at the garden. She began planning the day they moved in. Life in Redemption Creek in 1879 was not easy in the way that city life had taught Grace to think of ease. The winters were hard. The altitude caused headaches in visitors and occasional shortness of breath. The legal infrastructure of the territory was still being built, and the building was slow and uneven, and there were injustices that Calvin encountered in his work that he could not always fix and that he brought home heavy with. And Grace learned to be the person who could sit with that weight alongside him, not to remove it, which was not always possible, but to share the carrying of it. But there was also extraordinary beauty. The mountains, the sky, which in Colorado is its own enormous ongoing event. The way the town grew and changed and became more itself. A new doctor arrived in the fall of 1879. A young woman from Chicago named Dr. Frances Holt, who was the second female physician licensed in Colorado, and who became one of Grace's closest friends within a month. A new family arrived every few months, and Grace taught their children, and the school grew, and she petitioned the town council for a second teacher, and hired one by 1880. A young man named Arthur Price from Ohio, who was terrified of everything for approximately 3 months, and then became entirely excellent. Silas Drummond was convicted in Denver in the spring of 1880. He received a 12-year sentence for fraud and conspiracy. His properties were seized and the proceeds distributed, under Judge Carver's oversight, to the families he had wronged. The Garza family's land was fully restored. A portion went to a fund for Margaret Reed's children's education, administered by the county. Grace received a formal acknowledgment from Judge Carver's office, thanking her for her role in bringing the case to light. It was a single formal paragraph. She framed it and hung it in her study above the writing desk. Their first child, a son, was born in March of 1881. They named him Edward after Grace's father. He arrived on a Sunday morning in the middle of a late-season snowstorm, with Dr. Francis Holt attending, and Calvin pacing the kitchen with sustained, contained anxiety that Francis found both touching and slightly irritating in the way of a doctor whose patient was fine and whose patient's husband was not helping. Grace delivered without complication. She was, as Francis would tell people afterward, the most organized person Francis had ever attended in labor, in the sense that Grace appeared to have decided in advance how she was going to manage it and was executing the plan with characteristic precision. Calvin came in when it was done, when Francis gave him a nod from the doorway, and he sat on the edge of the bed with this son, this small, red-faced, extraordinarily new person with his mother's dark hair and his father's square jaw held carefully in the crook of his arm, and he looked at Grace with an expression that had no precedent in his face, something entirely new and enormous. "Edward," Grace said. "Edward," Calvin agreed. He looked at the baby, then at his wife. "He chose good parents." Grace laughed, which was painful and worth it. "He had no choice," she said. "He was assigned to us." "Then we will make it a good assignment," Calvin said, and they did. The years in Redemption Creek moved with the mountains slowly, grandly, always with something new in the changing light. Edward grew into a serious, curious boy with his mother's love of books and his father's steady patience, and when he was 3, his sister arrived, named Clara after Grace's sister, who came back to Colorado for the birth and stayed for a month and cried when she had to leave. Clara Collier was louder than her brother and more immediately sociable, and had opinions from approximately the age of 6 months that she communicated with great conviction. She was Grace's daughter in the most visible possible way, in the sense that by the time she was 4 she was already correcting the arithmetic on the slates Grace brought home from school. Grace continued teaching. She and Arthur Price, who had long since overcome his initial terror, ran the school together with the kind of partnership that produces excellent results, complementary in their approaches, respectful of each other's strengths, agreed on the fundamental things that mattered. By 1882, they had 67 enrolled students and were working on a petition to the county for a proper 2-classroom building. Calvin's work evolved with the territory. Colorado became a state in 1876, and the legal infrastructure developed and the court system became more established, and the kind of land fraud that Silas Drummond had practiced became harder to execute and easier to prosecute. Not impossible injustice is persistent, but harder. Calvin developed a reputation in the territory that reached beyond Redemption Creek, a reputation for steady, principled law enforcement that had no patience for the use of power against the vulnerable, and he was periodically offered positions in larger towns and twice approached about running for county sheriff. He turned them down. He was, as he told Grace, exactly where he intended to be. "You could do more at a larger scale," Grace said, when the county sheriff question came up the second time. She was not pushing him, simply thinking through it with him as she always did. "I could," he said, "but more at a larger scale is not the same as more good. I know this place. I know these people. I know which family is struggling and which child is going to grow up with a temper that needs early guidance and which situation is heading toward trouble before it gets there. That kind of knowing is not transferable. It is built." He paused. "We built it together." She thought about this. "Yes," she said, "we did." "Would you want to leave?" he asked, because he would if she said yes. She knew he would. She looked out the kitchen window at the mountains, which never got ordinary no matter how long you lived with them. She thought about the school, the 67 children, the friends she had made in this valley, the graves in the small churchyard. Because this was life, and life included graves of people she had known, the way the town had shaped itself around the values that its people brought to it, imperfectly and slowly, and with the particular integrity of something being made by hand. "No," she said, "I would not want to leave." In the summer of 1883, when Edward was 2 and Clara was 6 months old, No, let me correct that. Edward was born in 1881, making him 2 in 1883, and Clara had been born in late 1882, making her about 7 months old in the summer of 1883. Grace decided it was time to write the letters. Not to a judge this time. Not about fraud. She wrote to 3 teacher training schools in the East, and to the Colorado State Education Board, and to 2 sympathetic journalists she had corresponded with over the years. She wrote about the school at Redemption Creek, and about the gap that existed in the territory and across the West, between the growing population of children who needed education and the supply of trained teachers to provide it. The letters were long and specific and persuasive, and 3 of the 5 recipients wrote back with genuine interest, and one of the journalists published a piece in a Denver newspaper about the educational needs of Colorado's frontier communities that was reprinted in papers as far east as Chicago. The Colorado State Education Board eventually established a teacher recruitment program that brought 12 new teachers to rural Colorado communities in its first year. One of them, a young woman named Sophie from Cincinnati, who arrived in Redemption Creek in the fall of 1884 to take a position in the expanded school, told Grace that she had read about Redemption Creek specifically in a newspaper article, and had decided that if this kind of school could exist in a mountain town in Colorado, she wanted to be part of it. Grace shook Sophie's hand and showed her the classroom, and went home that evening and told Calvin that she thought the work was working. He was sitting at the kitchen table with Edward on his knee, helping the boy trace letters on a slate. Edward was 3 by now, deeply interested in how letters worked, and Calvin was systematically teaching him all of them in the same quiet, patient way he did everything. "Of course it's working," Calvin said. "It has always been working. You just don't always let yourself see it while it's happening. Someone has to keep track of whether it's actually making a difference," Grace said. "And someone else gets to just appreciate that the person doing the tracking is remarkable," Calvin said. Edward looked up from the slate. "What's remarkable?" he asked. "Your mother," Calvin said with complete simplicity. Edward looked at Grace. Then he held up the slate on which he had traced a crooked but identifiable letter G. G for Grace, he said. Grace sat down at the table and put her hand over the slate and over her son's small hand and looked at her husband across the table and felt, again, the fullness of it, the life that had been built here in this valley, in this house, with these people, the life chosen with courage and sustained with love. The 3rd child came in 1885, another son, named Thomas, because Grace had never quite let go of Thomas Reed and his widow's letter, and the simple, necessary act of naming someone after a man who had been wronged, as a private acknowledgement that he mattered and that his name would continue. Thomas was an exuberant child from the beginning, loud and physical and full of laughter, entirely unlike his older brother's seriousness and his sister's sharp intelligence, and entirely himself in a way that delighted everyone who knew him. Calvin said once that Thomas had somehow been born already knowing that life was good, which was either a gift or a tremendous piece of luck, and either way should be carefully nurtured. By 1886, the school at Redemption Creek had 3 teachers, a new building with 2 large classrooms and a small library. The library was Grace's particular achievement, 60 years of literature on those shelves and an enrollment of 81 students, which had necessitated the addition of a 3rd teacher the previous fall. Grace was 34. Calvin was 39. They had been married 7 years, and the 7 years had done to them what good years do to people who are committed to each other, deepened the knowing, worn away anything that was not essential, left what was true. They still had coffee in the morning, black for him and with cream for her when they could get it, and they still talked about everything. The books, the town, the children, the politics of the territory, the news from the East. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with strong opinions and the confidence to express them, and the arguments were almost always interesting and sometimes heated and never frightening, because, Underneath everything was the bedrock of the fundamental and mutual and completely committed love. She still wore the wool coat, the charcoal one from Philadelphia, on the coldest mornings, though it was now worn at one elbow and had been re-hemmed twice and repaired along the collar seam by careful stitching. Calvin had suggested once that she might have a new coat made, and she had looked at him as though he had suggested something slightly absurd and said that she fully intended to wear this coat until it disintegrated, and that would probably be after she did, and he had not raised the subject again. He had understood, of course. The coat was not fabric. The coat was courage. She had worn it from the first step onto that dusty street, and it had served her perfectly, and she was going to keep it. One afternoon in the early fall of 1886, when the aspens were beginning their turn again, Grace never failed to register the aspens turning, because the first time she had seen it, on horseback on the eastern ridge, had been the day Calvin asked to court her. And some things brand themselves into you permanently. One of her students, a girl named Maria Garza, came to her after school. Maria was 12, the daughter of the Garzas who had come back to the South Creek Valley when their land was restored. She was a serious, observant child with a gift for language that Grace had been carefully cultivating for 2 years. Mrs. Collier, Maria said, with the formality of a child raising an important topic. I want to be a teacher. Grace looked at her for a moment. She thought about a woman sitting in a narrow office in Philadelphia reading a newspaper advertisement. She thought about courage and coats and the decision to stand somewhere else. That is an excellent ambition, Grace said. Let's talk about what it requires. And they sat down together in the school that Grace Whitfield had come west to build, in the town that had needed her and that she had needed in equal measure, and talked about the future with the absolute practical seriousness that the future deserves. That evening, Grace told Calvin about Maria Garza's ambition while they sat on the porch in the cooling September air. Thomas was asleep. Clara was in her room reading something she was supposed to have put away half an hour ago and that Grace was choosing this evening to allow. Edward was doing arithmetic at the kitchen table, a candle burning beside the slate. The Garza family, Calvin said. They've been at the South Creek place 3 years now. 4 years next spring, Grace said. They came back in November of 1882 after the full legal restoration. He nodded. He was watching the mountains, which were doing the thing they did at dusk in September, going from purple to blue to almost black while the sky above them stayed amber and rose. How do you feel? He asked. It was the question he always asked, in the particular way he asked it, not idle conversation, not social filler, but genuine inquiry, the real wanting to know. Grace thought about it. She thought about the road from Philadelphia, the train rattling westward, the stagecoach and the dust, and the first sight of the mountains on the horizon. She thought about a saloon doorway and a loaded gun, and a man with a marshal's badge who had stepped between her and the barrel without drawing his own weapon. She thought about a table covered in documents and a pot of coffee and the slow, careful building of trust, and then of love. She thought about 3 children and a house and a school and a town and a coat that had been worn through every season of it. Complete, she said. I feel complete. He reached across the space between their porch chairs and took her hand. His hand was the same as it had always been, warm, solid, the hands of a man who had done necessary things with them and would do more. She laced her fingers through his. You said, he said, his voice easy and warm, when you walked out of that saloon the first day that you had chosen the right territory. You said that, Grace said, or the shape of it. You said it back to me later. I did. Were you right? She looked at the mountains going dark and the amber sky fading and the first star appearing above the western ridge. She thought about all of it, every choice, every letter written, every student taught, every morning of coffee and mountains, and the man beside her on the porch. She thought about Thomas Reed's widow with her letter. She thought about Maria Garza wanting to be a teacher. She thought about the coat hanging on the hook inside the door. Yes, she said. I was exactly right. The star above the western ridge was joined by another, and then another, and the Colorado night came down complete and cold and full of light, and Grace Whitfield Grace Collier sat on the porch of her house in Redemption Creek with her husband's hand in hers and the sound of her children inside and the mountains holding the dark, and she was exactly where she had chosen to be. Which was, in the end, the only kind of home worth having. The aspens turned again the following October, and the October after that, and each year the gold of them was more familiar and not 1 degree less astonishing. And each year Grace rode up the eastern ridge with Calvin to watch the valley from the place where everything had truly begun. And each year they sat their horses side by side in the October light and said very little, because very little needed saying. Edward grew up to study law in Denver, returning to Redemption Creek to practice, with his mother's instinct for justice and his father's steadiness, and his grandmother Eleanor's particular way of making people feel heard. Clara became a teacher, not in Redemption Creek. She was too much her own person to stay in her mother's school, but in a new town 20 miles south, and she was, by every account, remarkable. Thomas became a rancher, buying land in the South Creek Valley adjacent to the Garza property, becoming neighbors and eventually close friends with Maria Garza's younger brother Raphael, a friendship that lasted their entire lives. Maria Garza did become a teacher. She trained in Denver and returned to teach at the Redemption Creek School for 3 years, then went on to help establish a school in a new settlement further west. She wrote to Grace every few months for decades, and Grace wrote back, and the correspondence was rich and detailed and full of the kind of specific observations that only careful teachers make. Ned Carley served his reduced sentence and rebuilt his life. He and Eliza stayed in Redemption Creek, where Eliza recovered fully from her illness, and Ned worked in the feed store before eventually buying a share in it. They never spoke much of the Drummond years, but when Calvin's name came up, Ned would always say, carefully and completely, "A good man, a truly good man," and that was more than sufficient. Wick Patterson, the federal marshal who had come for Silas's arrest, kept in contact with Calvin over the years, a correspondence of 2 men who respected each other's work, exchanging information about cases and occasional professional counsel. He came to Redemption Creek once more, in 1888, on his way through the territory, and Grace fed him dinner and he sat at the kitchen table, and said that Redemption Creek was the most organized and peaceable town he had come across in 20 years of federal service, and that he attributed this partly to good law enforcement, and partly to the fact that the schoolteacher had built 3 generations of citizens who understood the difference between what was legal and what was right. "They are not always the same thing," Wick said. "No," Grace agreed, "but the gap between them is where good people have to live and work." Wick looked at her and then at Calvin. "You said she was something," he said. "I did not say that," Calvin said. "You implied it," Wick said. "Extensively." Calvin did not argue the point. The charcoal wool coat finally gave out in the fall of 1890 when Grace was 38. The fabric had thinned past repair at the elbows, and the collar lining had come entirely free, and the hem had been taken up and let down and taken up again until there was nothing left to work with. She held it in her hands for a long moment before she acknowledged that it was done, and then she folded it carefully and put it in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Calvin had noticed. He always noticed. He said nothing that evening, because he understood the weight of it and understood that she needed a little time. 3 days later, a package arrived by post from Denver. Inside was a length of deep charcoal wool nearly identical in weight and shade to the original coat, with a note from Calvin that said only, "For the next territory." She made the new coat herself, cut on the same lines as the first one, sturdy and practical and built to be worn through whatever came next. She wore it to school the following Monday, and her students said nothing, because they were children and did not know the significance of coats. But Arthur Price, who had been teaching alongside her for 10 years and had heard the story of the saloon, and the wool coat the way all Redemption Creek eventually heard it, looked at it when she came in and nodded once, with a small smile that said everything he did not say out loud. On the evening of their 15th wedding anniversary, in June of 1894, Calvin took Grace back to the eastern ridge. They rode up as the sun was going low, the same trail they had ridden the first time, the aspens different now, older, taller, and at the top, the valley spread below them in the golden evening light, larger now than it had been, more buildings, more farms, the town's grid clearer from above, the church spire that had been rebuilt the year before. 15 years, Calvin said. 15 years, Grace agreed. We have built something here, he said. We have, she said. We are still building. He reached into his coat pocket and produced something she did not expect, a letter. He held it out to her. She took it and opened it. It was from the Colorado State Board of Education. It announced that they were establishing a formal teaching fellowship program to be named the Whitfield Fellowship, in recognition of Grace Collier's, née Whitfield, contributions to educational development in frontier Colorado. The fellowship would fund advanced training for new teachers in rural and frontier communities across the state, with the first cohort to begin the following year. She read it twice. Then she looked at Calvin. "You knew about this," she said. "I was consulted," he said, in the manner of someone choosing his words very carefully. "You organized it," she said. "I may have written a letter," he said, "or several letters to several people." "Calvin Collier," she said. "Grace Collier," he said, absolutely unapologetic. She looked at the letter again, and then at the valley, and then at him, and she thought about the first letter she had ever written to Redemption Creek, in a narrow office on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, sitting with a newspaper advertisement and a decision made. She thought about every letter since, to Judge Carver, to publishers, to the Education Board, to Margaret Reed in the East. She thought about the letters Maria Garza sent, and the letters from Clara about her school, and the letter from her mother that had arrived the previous Christmas, a leaner, now 70, and still sharp, and full of opinions about everything. All of it built from letters, all of it built from the decision to write. "Thank you," she said. "You gave this place something it did not have," he said simply. "It is right that the place acknowledge it." She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and reached across and took his hand, exactly as she had done 1,000 times on this porch and 1,000 other places over 15 years. His hand was the same as it had always been. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her. He had not seen this expression before, this particular combination of certainty and lightness. "We are going to have another baby," she said. He was still for a moment, and then something in his face did what it always did when something true and enormous happened. It shifted, rearranged itself around the thing, made room. "Grace," he said. "I know," she said. "We are not young." She was 38, he was 43. "No," he said, "but we are not old either." He squeezed her hand. "And we are, as you have pointed out on several occasions, still building." She laughed. The valley below them caught the last of the sun, and the mountains went from gold to purple, and the first star appeared above the western ridge, and Grace Collier sat on horseback on the eastern ridge above Redemption Creek, Colorado, with her husband's hand in hers and a letter in her pocket and another life beginning, and she was, as she had been on the porch 8 years before, complete. The fourth child, a boy, was born in January of 1895. In the house on the north edge of town, with Frances Holt attending, Frances, who had been their friend for 15 years now, and who had delivered 3 of their 4 children, and who showed up with her medical bag and her characteristic brisk competence, and absolutely no patience for unnecessary drama. They named the baby James. James Calvin Collier, named half for the father of the man she loved and half for the man himself, which Calvin objected to slightly on the grounds of not being entirely comfortable with the vanity of it. And Grace said it was not vanity, it was accuracy. And the argument lasted approximately 10 minutes, and she won it, as she won most arguments, through the application of irrefutable logic delivered with complete calm. James was born into a town that knew his parents, a school that carried his mother's name in its new fellowship program, and a family that was large and various and full of people who had come west for different reasons and stayed because they had found what they were looking for, or built it, which comes to the same thing in the end. He was, from the beginning, a happy child. Not the exuberant happiness of Thomas, which was extroverted and loud, but the quiet happiness of someone who has arrived in a life that fits. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's hazel eyes, and as he grew he developed his mother's precision with language and his father's gift for stillness, which was, Grace thought, the best possible combination. Redemption Creek grew through the 1890s as the territory grew, as the state of Colorado grew and developed and became more of itself. The railroad reached closer, making travel easier. The school expanded again. The church was rebuilt larger. A second doctor joined Francis Holt's practice, a young man named Dr. Samuel Park, who had trained in the East and come west specifically because he had read about Francis Holt and wanted to work alongside someone of her caliber. The injustices did not disappear. They never do, not entirely, not all at once. There were still moments when the law bent in the wrong direction, when money spoke too loudly, when the vulnerable were left without recourse. Calvin kept working. Grace kept writing. The Whitfield Fellowship sent its first cohort of teachers to Colorado's frontier communities in 1895, and the second cohort in 1896. And by the turn of the century, it had trained 43 teachers who collectively served thousands of children in communities across the state. She received, in 1900, a letter from the Colorado Department of Education thanking her for the ongoing contribution of the fellowship, and noting that the program had been studied and modeled by education boards in 2 other western states. The letter was formal and official and thoroughly satisfying. She read it to Calvin over breakfast, and he listened with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, and when she finished he said, 43 teachers. 43 so far, she said. He shook his head slowly, with the expression of a man who has never once doubted the person he married and finds himself still, after all these years, occasionally staggered by the evidence of that person's correctness. You chose the right territory, he said. She looked up from the letter. It was the old phrase from the first days, the phrase that had been between them since the beginning, like a quiet promise of what was possible. You said that, she said. And you proved it, he said. She set the letter down on the table and looked at him, at this man she had loved for 21 years, who had been her partner and her equal and her greatest comfort and her most challenging conversation, and the person she most wanted to tell everything to, who had stood between her and a gun barrel on the first day and had stood beside her every day since. We proved it, she corrected. He put his coffee cup down. He reached across the breakfast table and took her face in his hands, gently, the way a person handles something precious, and he kissed her, not the brief habitual morning kiss of long marriage, but the kind of kiss that remembers everything. The saloon doorway and the aspens turning and the ridge above the valley and 15 years and 4 children, and a fellowship named for her name and a coat worn through and replaced, and all the letters written, and all the distances crossed. When he sat back, he was smiling that full, rearranging smile that she had first seen on horseback on an October ridge, the one that changed everything about the light. You are right, he said, as usual. As frequently, Grace said, which was accurate and which made him laugh. Outside the kitchen window, the mountains stood where they had always stood, enormous, patient, indifferent and beautiful, the same mountains that had first appeared on the horizon through the window of a westbound train to a woman who was wearing her courage like a coat and going somewhere she had never been, toward something she believed was possible. The mountains did not know her name. The mountains did not care. But Redemption Creek knew her name, and the 43 teachers knew her name, and the hundreds of children who had sat in the school she had built knew her name, and Calvin Collier knew her name, the way a person knows the truest and most essential thing about the life they have chosen to live. And the life they had built in this valley, in this town with these children, in this house with its shelves of books and its kitchen stove and its porch looking west toward the mountains was full. Genuinely, completely, permanently full. Grace Whitfield had come west wearing her courage like a coat. Calvin Collier had said she had chosen the right territory. And both of them together had spent the rest of their lives proving that the most important journeys are not the ones that take you somewhere new, but the ones that take you, finally and at last, exactly home.